Hi, my name is Karen Lang, and I'm a public health educator and author, as well as a Christian educator and author. I have a degree in public health and my master's in theology. And today I get to teach a class to you guys that I'm really enjoying doing because it is a combination of both of my fields. We are going to be covering what forgiveness does to your body and soul. So let's start for a moment with what is health. Health involves more than your physical being. Health includes your physical, mental, social, and spiritual ability to live a life that is fully functional and enjoyable. It is about being able to be pain-free, able to get around, able to think and learn clearly. It is about the ability to interact well with others, as well as to have a good interaction with God. And being somewhere stuck between forgiveness and unforgiveness can impact all four of those areas in horrible ways. So I want to start for a moment with what is forgiveness. Forgiveness is a conscious decision to let go of your anger and your feelings of unrighteousness and injustice in order to get peace for yourself. Forgiveness is about letting go of the hurt that somebody else has done to you in order to live in a moment of life that is enjoyable and precious. God does not ask us to forgive and forget. And we need to start with that concept because that's a concept that comes straight out of hell. Satan tells us we need to forgive and forget, and we can't forget, then we think we've also not forgiven. But that is not what God has ever called us to do. He has only told us to forgive. He tells us to forgive in Mark 11, where he tells us that if we're standing and praying and we realize that somebody holds something against us, we need to go and ask for forgiveness or offer them for forgiveness. If we don't forgive, Matthew 5 tells us that God cannot forgive us. Clearly, God thinks forgiveness is very, very important. And in fact, in every world religion except Scientology, which isn't really a religion, but it wants to be, there's a concept of forgiveness, whether it is our need to ask forgiveness of God, or it is our need to ask for forgiveness from others, or that others need to forgive us. Forgiveness is incorporated in every single religion. And that's because Satan understands that there has to be a concept of forgiveness for there to be a concept of doing right and wrong. So even when he creates false religions, he creates them with a concept of forgiveness in them. So I watched a video one day from a woman named Sarah Montana. She had her entire family killed in a crime. And she is Jewish. And she said that she could not forgive the people that had harmed her in her life for what they had done to her parents and her siblings. She could not forgive the killer for killing her father because that was up to her father to do. But she could issue forgiveness to the killer that she didn't have her father with her for the rest of her life, or to walk her down the aisle, or to play with her grandchildren. I like that vision because it helps you to understand a little bit how forgiveness works in terms of big tragedies, but also in terms of everyday issues. You have to sort of be able to see how an event impacted your life, not only in that moment, but sometimes in long term. And I like the sentence that she says. Do you know that there are 62 passages in the Bible that use the word forgive, and 27 that use the word forgiveness, and not one of them tells you how to do it? God asks us to forgive. He asks us to live in forgiveness, but he really doesn't give us a lot of instructions on how to do that. And that's because he expects us to turn to him when we're hurt, turn to him when we've been harmed, and he will walk us through that process. You will hear at the end of this class a little bit about how to approach that process, but you need to understand that this is going to come mostly between you and God and what he's showing you in the truth of your experiences. I want to start with this concept of social health. So in America, 62% of Americans say that they need more forgiveness in their life. It helps to free us from our past, and it helps to allow us to live in our present. It allows us to interact with new people without holding on to the baggage of the old people that were in our lives. It's so important to be able to move forward in trust and a feeling of safety, to have forgiven the people that have been in your past and have hurt you. It is much easier when you live in a lifestyle of forgiveness to make new friends, because you aren't bothered by the harm that was done by people in the past. On the mental health piece of it, when we don't forgive, we see things more difficult than they appear. It can drag down our emotions and make us sad and weary and tired. One of the heaviest emotional burdens we carry is a lack of forgiveness, is a quote from Deepak Chopra. So even when you're not a Christian, the understanding of living in unforgiveness impacts that mental health piece, no matter who you are. When we forgive, it automatically lowers anxiety, depression, and stress in our mental health. It decreases PTSD symptoms when you can live in a moment of forgiveness. It helps us to concentrate better. We don't have these ongoing thoughts of how bad our life is, or how much somebody hurt us, or if the person before us is going to hurt us, and we can focus on the task at hand when we are living in forgiveness. When we forgive other people, we are also much less likely to abuse alcohol and drugs. And I think you see that so often in those who have drug and alcohol addictions. They've often had a trauma in their past that they haven't been able to release and give out forgiveness for. And so they're driven to alcohol and drugs to cover the pain of that trauma, and then to cover the continual pain of trying to live a life filled with unforgiveness. I like some of the results that have come out of studies on the physical pieces of forgiveness, however. In the Netherlands, they did a study a few years ago with business students about what telling stories about forgiveness and unforgiveness did to people. In one story, they asked the business students to give them a story of a time where they had given forgiveness to someone, and then half of the class was asked to tell a story where there was no forgiveness offered at the time. Then they were taken outside and they were shown a mountain, and they were asked to estimate how tall the mountain was, how high the mountain was. Those who talked most recently about living in unforgiveness saw the mountain as much, much steeper than the people who were talking about forgiveness. It literally changes our perception of the world around us when we are stuck in a world of unforgiveness. Life seems harder. Life seems more like a challenge. The mountain in front of you looks steeper. In another study they did with a different set of business students, they asked the business students again to tell a story of forgiveness, and the other half of the class to tell a story of unforgiveness, and then they asked the students to jump. Those who told stories of unforgiveness could not jump as high as the stories of people who were living in forgiveness. And again, this is just a sign of what something inside our heart and our mind does to our physical body. It literally drags us down. We do not have the strength, we do not have the stamina to jump as high, to accomplish things as easily when we live in unforgiveness. Forgiveness also strengthens our heart. When we can forgive somebody, it lowers our cholesterol levels. It improves our sleep. It reduces the pain we feel in our body. I see this a lot when I work with women who are part of the domestic violence, have a domestic violence background, especially those who have domestic violence and fibromyalgia or arthritis, that as they are able to forgive that abuser for their past, forgive maybe their friends who didn't step in and help, forgive the system that compounded the abuse, the more they're able to forgive and get rid of the pain that they felt in the past emotionally, the more likely they are to live with less pain with the fibromyalgia, less problems with the arthritis as well. It lowers our blood pressure and it increases our survival rates. If we have a heart attack and we are somebody who is angry, we are more likely to die of that heart attack than someone who lives in peace on a regular basis. And so this is really crucial for us to understand. Unforgiveness brings hostility into our lives. Whether we think of ourselves as hostile or we think of ourselves as wounded, our body reacts to our unwillingness to forgive as if we are being hostile to the world. And hostility increases inflammation in our body. That increases, as I said a minute ago, arthritis and fibromyalgia. It makes breathing more difficult, especially if you have asthma or COPD. It can make autoimmune disorders harder to treat and harder to live with. It can bring blood sugar levels out of control. It makes it harder for type 1 diabetics who use insulin to find that on a daily basis that same amount of insulin brings down their blood sugar levels, because today they might be angrier than they were yesterday, or today something might have triggered those thoughts of the things that caused them pain in the past. And so then their insulin and their blood sugar doesn't react together as well as it does on a day when they're calmer. It increases our risk of stomach problems. Ulcers probably the one that we most think of, but it also makes things like IBS and colonitis much more difficult to deal with when we're living in unforgiveness and hostility. It increases the likelihood that we get infections and injuries. It lowers our immune system, and that makes us much more likely to get a small infection and have it spread to our body. Because we are spending so much of our time thinking about our past, our pain, our anxieties, we're less likely to pay attention to what's going on around us, so we're more likely to end up in an accident. We don't want any of these things to happen to you. We also find that people who have a higher inflammation rate in their body are much more likely to develop severe symptoms of Alzheimer's, and do that at an earlier age. So it impacts our brain and the way our brain processes things as well. Hostility and inflammation increase your likeliness of gingivitis, which is the infections in your gums and around your teeth. You really wouldn't think that something that's holding into your heart and your brain, that feeling angry or upset about your past would impact your mouth like that, but it does. And the big problem with having gingivitis is that's a gateway into infections in your whole body. People who have inflammation and problems with their mouth are much more likely to have heart problems, have asthma problems, and get bloodborne infections, because our system of saliva and digestion to kill germs doesn't happen when the germs can enter small cuts and openings right within our gums. Hostility and inflammation also cause problems with eye diseases. It makes things like glaucoma and cataracts more severe and sometimes harder to treat. Healing also doesn't happen as easily within our body after we've had surgery to correct something, when we are holding on to anger and hostility. So what does it really mean to forgive on a Christian basis? So as a Christian, we need to be sure that we are in right standing with God, that when we make a mistake, that we are able to say to God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And then at the same time, we need to offer that same grace that God gives us to other people when they make mistakes. And even when they are violent, or it's not a mistake and it's aggressive, then it's important that we are able to say, I'm going to forgive them. Not because it does anything for that person, but because it frees us, because it brings us peace and joy. This is why God has said that this is important, because it's about our living our best, healthiest life. Every rule that God has in the Bible is not about imposing random rules on us. It's about helping us to live our best lives. And forgiving people helps us to live our best lives. So if you're stuck in a moment of unforgiveness, if you're struggling to figure out how to learn how to forgive, I want to give you some suggestions. Start by forgiving the people who do little stupid things. Forgive your child who spills the milk on the table. Say it verbally out loud. I forgive you for spilling your milk. Let's get it cleaned up. Instead of reacting with anger or frustration in the moment. Forgive the guy who cuts you off in traffic. Forgive the person who wanders across the street while you're driving and makes you feel like it's unsafe and you might hit them. Forgive those little moments where it's really not a life or death forgiveness thing. They really didn't cause you harm. They just panicked you a little bit. When you start to operate in forgiveness on the little moments, then it's much easier to forgive on the bigger moments. Tell God how much someone has hurt you and ask him to heal that hurt within you. I like to say there are three beings in the world that know every bad thing that happened to you: God, Satan, and yourself. When you share those bad moments with God and you ask him to heal those hurts in your life, you give him the opportunity to repair everything that's been done with you, but you also take a weapon away from Satan. If you refuse to tell God that somebody hurt you, that it was painful, that you need to have your wounds healed, then Satan will take and poke and dig at those wounds. He will use them for the rest of your life to bother you with them. So turn them over to God early so that they aren't a weapon in Satan's hands. I also like to start with that Bible verse, I believe, help my unbelief. So often it's not a matter of belief. It's, I want to forgive, help my unforgiveness, Lord. When we can start there, when we can admit that forgiving is just difficult and hard in this moment, it makes it so much easier for God to step in and encourage that forgiveness. Maybe we've only partially forgiven him, but God's already bringing peace into our heart, and then we can go ahead and forgive that person completely. You may find that you've had a lifetime of bitterness. You may want to sit down on a quiet day, maybe take a whole weekend, and kind of break your life up into maybe 5-year segments, and kind of go through and list the things that were both good and bad in your life. Praise God for those good moments. Ask God for forgiveness if you've done something wrong in those moments, and ask God to help you to forgive people who have harmed you in those moments. This is going to take you a little bit of time. You might have to do it a couple of times through, just to make sure that you've really covered everything. And that's okay. God doesn't expect us to just instantly be all better. Just like he doesn't expect us to forgive and forget. He knows that this is a process. He made us as people who have to think and have to figure it out a little bit on our own as well. And so he's okay with us processing forgiveness. He's okay with us processing the pain. He just doesn't want us to refuse to forgive. Okay, so as you're learning to forgive people, you need to understand when and when you cannot forgive and how this process works. You cannot forgive somebody when you are still in the middle of injury. So when an abusive husband says to the wife, you have to forgive me because that's biblical, but he's still being abusive, there's no way you can offer forgiveness. And we see that in the Bible when Jesus is dying on the cross. He is in the middle of the biggest injury to his body and his soul. He is separated from God. And he does not say on the cross, God, I forgive them. He says, God, forgive them. They do not know what they do. He is not offering forgiveness. He is asking God to, because he knows in the middle of that pain, he can't do it. It's against his human nature. But he knows he has to tie into his God nature to offer forgiveness anyway. You cannot forgive for selfish reasons. You cannot decide you're going to forgive someone to take the high and mighty road. Well, I forgave you, and so it's okay now. You can't forgive to be a good person. Yes, God expects us to forgive, but forgiveness has to come from a genuine desire to release our own pain and injury and to free them from the consequences of us being angry. You cannot forgive because somebody else demands it of you. You cannot forgive in order to avoid the painful process of healing. Forgiveness doesn't do that. You still have to heal. You cannot forgive to forget. Our bodies and brains don't work like that. God doesn't ask us to do that, like I said earlier. He wants us to forgive, but we're always going to remember. But the memory should not cause trauma and pain in our lives as we go forward. You cannot forgive from a sense of ego and pride. And you cannot forgive what you cannot acknowledge. And so that's so important. So often we minimize the damage and the hurt and the harm that has been done to us because we know people who have had it worse. But it doesn't matter. If we don't acknowledge it, we can't forgive it. I worked with a woman who had been involved in a serious car accident when she was a teenager. She had a lot of pain. And she said, I don't understand all that is going on with this pain because I forgave my boyfriend who was driving the car at the time. And as she's telling me the story, several times she mentions that her boyfriend was unlicensed and that his mother knew it and that his mother had allowed him to drive unlicensed. And I said to her, did you ever forgive his mother? And she said, why would I do that? I said, because you're holding on to anger that his mother let him drive unlicensed, that maybe that was part of the reason for the accident. I said, you need to forgive his mother. The moment she forgave his mother, the pain went away. It is truly that immediately spectacular for some people. It is truly more of a process for others. But when we look at an incident and we are trying to decide who and what needs to be forgiven, we need to look at more than the person who harmed us. For a domestic violence victim, it may be the husband. You may also want to forgive your in-laws who raised him to behave like that. You may want to forgive yourself for allowing yourself to be in that situation. You may need to give forgiveness to your friends who didn't stand up and encourage you to get away. You may have tried to go to a domestic violence shelter and not found the help that you needed, and you may need to forgive them. You may have gone to court and found yourself being yelled at by a judge, and you need to forgive them. You need to be able to step back from the incidents that have happened in your life and see the big picture of it and see all the people that contributed to your pain, and then help you to forgive everybody involved. One of the things that I've learned as I've done bullying training is victims very seldom are angry at their bully. They are a little bit angry at their bully, but they are mostly angry at all of the people who witnessed the bullying and didn't stand up and defend them. This is where you see students coming in with guns and shooting up the entire school. They weren't bullied by the entire school. They were bullied by one or two people, but they are angry at the entire school for not standing up and defending them. We need to see who else harmed us in the middle of our pain and misery. And the only way we can do that is to step back away from it for a while and to be able to evaluate. God may call you back to look at something you've already given forgiveness for again and again until you've found all of the people that you need to forgive. It's always a process with God. He's always trying to peel away layers of the onion and get down to a point where it's just you and him loving on each other without all those skins and all the problems that are piled on top of it. If you're looking for a step to forgiveness, look at what happened. Evaluate how it hurt you, all the ways it hurt you. Recognize that there are always three sides to a situation. The person who harmed you, yours, and God's. Try to get to a point in your recovery with forgiving that you can really see what happened from God's point of view, because that will help you to deal with forgiveness. That will help you to give forgiveness. That will help you to make sure that you're forgiving everybody along the way. You have the side of the person who was the abuser or the harmer in the situation. God understands why they did it, what kind of trauma they came from in the past, what maybe you did that triggered them that wasn't even something you intended to trigger, but it just happened because of their background. He understands your side as well. He understands that you didn't have the ability to avoid the problem or the conflict. He understands where you came from in terms of your past trauma and harms. He understands all of your life experiences and all the life experiences of your abuser that led to this moment of conflict. Whether it is all of the experiences that led to a car accident, all of the experiences that led to somebody physically hitting you, all of the experiences that led to a lifetime of domestic abuse or a rape event. It really doesn't matter what it is, how serious or not serious it is. There are both sides of the story are there, and then there is God at the top, knowing and understanding all and finding the truth in the middle of it. It's very important that we allow God to show us the truth in the middle of all of that. There's a book that I used to use with domestic violence victims called Emotionally Destructive Relationships. It was a fabulous book because it asked us to look at ourselves and understand why we allowed ourselves to remain in that situation. Sometimes we find that we have done something to add to the problem or cause the problem. Even in a car accident, we might have been hurrying and distracted and not paying attention to the car that came out of nowhere and hit us. Or maybe, we slipped on the ice and fell on top of somebody else. There's so many moments where we add to or contribute to what has happened to harm us. Not because we were really doing anything wrong, but because that's just how life works. We're out there having our lives and things happen. Do not define the person who harmed you by their worst moment in your life. You wouldn't want to be held responsible for your worst moment in somebody else's life. But that also does not mean that you have to let them back into your life. People who are toxic may stay toxic. They may not grow and learn from their behavior. God does not say forgive and forget. He also doesn't say forgive and allow them to do it again. He says forgive. So as you are forgiving and as you are moving along, I want to encourage you that God is not just about you issuing forgiveness. God is very clear that when you forgive somebody and you let it go, then He is a God of vengeance. He is a God of righteousness. He will work to restore the relationship between you and the person who harmed you by working on the person who harmed you. When we are angry and holding on to bitterness and resentment, it is very, very hard for God to be able to move in that person's life the way He wants to. But when we have let it go, then God can become the enemy to our enemies. And God as an enemy is something you do not want. You want God to be on your side, and you want God to be taking that person down in a way that doesn't harm them, but brings them to a salvation in God and brings them to a restoration and a friendship with you. It is so important to God that you leave righteousness and justice and vengeance to Him. And He promises in the Bible to do that for you as soon as you release that person with forgiveness. Because He's a loving God, and He needs you to be healed, and He needs them to be healed. And that's His goal. Every time harm happens between two people in the world, God wants the person who was harmed to be healed and to be living in peace. And He wants the person who harmed someone else to come to a knowledge of who He is and ask for forgiveness and repair and restore the relationship between God and themselves and between themselves and you. It is always God's heart. It is always God's goal. And so that is what we have to hold on to, is that God is not asking us to forgive and forget. He's not asking us to forgive and move on like it doesn't matter. He's not asking us to forgive and nothing will ever happen to them. He's promising us if we forgive, he will deal with them. And God's the perfect person to deal with everybody, because he knows you. He made them. He made everything about both of you, and he can fix it. He can restore it. So I want to encourage you that forgiveness is good for your body and your soul. It is good for your life and your future and your relationships with other people. And now I'm going to give my friend Alyssa, who's filming this, a minute to ask some questions to help you understand a little bit better.
So my first question is, as you're talking, if I'm feeling pain and I want to run away, what do I do with that?
So you want to take that pain and you want to give it to God. I like to imagine that pain as like a ball sitting in my chest. And I try to pull it out of my chest and in my hand, and I toss it up to God and leave it with him. It is very hard, especially for people who have not forgiven or who have had a lifetime of trauma, to be able to even sit in a class like this or to understand the importance of forgiveness. There are probably things in your life that you're like, I just can never forgive that person for that. That's okay right now. It really is. Start with the little processes of forgiving, and you will eventually be able to forgive the people you think are unforgivable. But don't worry about it right now. Worry about the things you can forgive. Worry about making that good relationship with God. Just pray that prayer. I want to forgive, Lord. I want to live in peace. Help my unforgiveness.
So if I'm in church leadership especially, and this can be other things, so what does that look like when you're teaching your people to forgive, but you also have to deal with situations that are wrong?
So it's so important that we stick to a very biblical view of what is right and wrong, that we turn to God when things have gone wrong. But in a church situation where you are teaching on the need to forgive, you can't allow an abuser to use that as a weapon. You can't allow someone who is assaulting a child or is a domestic violence victim or someone who's cheating in their business to sin simply because forgiveness exists. God doesn't allow us to live in sin just because he's willing to forgive it. He expects us to grow and learn and get better. And our churches need to set a standard that says that behavior is unacceptable. You need to ask for forgiveness. You need to go to counseling. You need to grow and change. You and your wife may need to be separated for a time if you can't get it together, because God values everybody living in a healthy relationship. And it's so important that as church leaders, we do that, and we don't candy coat all that pain with just, well, God will forgive it and you need to forgive and move on.
Is that the same thing? So, I mean, if I'm in a domestic violence situation right now, and I've had that mindset, oh, I just forgive him, I forgive him. How do I move to the point of being able to report a crime, or even just being able to speak up when I see something wrong with forgiveness on the table? Like, is there something wrong we think about that forgiveness when we think about addressing wrong issues? So
this goes back to sort of that moment I said earlier, you can't forgive in the middle of an incident. You cannot forgive while you are still living in a situation of domestic violence. It won't happen. You have to be away from the situation long enough to see how it impacts you to be able to give forgiveness. Otherwise, it's just a word you're saying to try to appease somebody, usually your abuser. It will take the strength of you sitting with God and saying, God, this is wrong. He is not supposed to be hurting me like this. She is not supposed to be verbally aggressive like this. Help me find the way you want me to get out of this situation. Who do I need to go talk to? Who do I need to seek help from? Do I go to the courts? Do I go to a domestic violence counselor? Do I go to my pastor? Where do I go to get help? Help me, Lord, I need help. And that's where you start with it. Once you're out of the situation, then you can begin to work on the forgiveness pieces of it. But don't get stuck in the concept that because you forgave somebody for abusing you, that God intends for you to stay there and forgive again and again and again. God says we need to forgive 70 times 7, but he doesn't mean that we're supposed to be living in that world, doing it day after day after day. We need to get out. We need to be safe. We need to forgive everything that happened. And that's the 70 times 7 piece of it, is we need to forgive all the pieces of the abuse, but after we're out of it. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. So if I have pain or heart problems or fibromyalgia or some kind of chronic thing, how do I know if that's tied to unforgiveness?
So the easiest way to know that is to just understand, first of all, it probably is, to some extent or another. We've all had harm, we've all had trauma in our lives, and we all have kind of candy-coated over it because we know somebody else that's had it worse. Sit down with God. Say to God, are there people in my life that I need to forgive? Are there situations in my life I need to forgive? Have I done something that I need to be forgiven for? God wants to make your relationship whole. He wants to make your body whole. If you ask, he will always tell you. He will remind you. He will bring up the person's face to your memory. He will remind you of a situation. Maybe you will see the person in a news article. He can do lots of different things. Maybe he'll play a song that brings you back to that moment. That he is very, very creative in how he will tell you what to address, but he will help you to address it. But I promise you that as you address these things, some of this will go away. You may still have, because we live in a fallen world, some physical health problems. But if you live with a lot of chronic pain, or you've had several heart attacks, I can almost be assured that you have trauma in your life that hasn't been forgiven completely.
So God is perfect. He doesn't need forgiveness. But why is it so hard to see him as good sometimes?
I think it's hard to see God as good sometimes because we think that God has complete control of the universe. We think that when we're involved in a car accident, God knew it was going to happen and he didn't do anything to stop it. But he created our world and he gave it to us to control. And we gave it to Satan in the act of disobedience in the garden with Adam and Eve. And so God set us up in a world and said, here, take control of it, have dominion, run it. We allowed Satan in to get control of it. And God says, I'm not going to step in unless you ask me for help. I'm not going to step in to this world that I created unless a human being says, God, come and move your will from heaven to earth. And so because of that, Satan has used that to say God doesn't care. God meant for you to get hurt. God intended for you to be in pain. Maybe you married someone and you were sure that they were the person that God intended for you to be married to. And then a few years down the line, they have a drinking problem, they're being abusive, and you think, well, that's the person God told me to marry. So God obviously knew that he was going to be abusive. He's not safe. God's not safe. God is always safe. We have human choices. We have desires and problems and our own issues that sometimes make us not behave the way God intended. If God set you in a marriage with someone who had no signs of having a problem before the marriage, and all of a sudden the person goes off the end and becomes abusive or becomes verbally argumentative or is just mean and hurtful, that's not what God meant for you. He also didn't mean that life for that person either. He hoped that putting the two of you together would give you guys balance and strength together. But we have the right to choose our own lives and to not follow God's will. And sometimes the person is choosing not to follow God's will. That doesn't make God a bad God. That makes God the God he promised to be. Someone who created us and is allowing us to live our lives. He hopes we'll live our lives according to his rules and with his best interest and our best interest in mind, but that doesn't always happen. God is still a good, loving God. You have to remember Satan is working hard to make God not look like a good, loving God, to make God look unsafe, to make his rules seem unreasonable, so that we don't end up in heaven with him. And that is the ultimate tragedy. If we allow people to harm us to such an extent that we don't feel safe with God, that we would rather not live as a Christian, then Satan has done immense damage, not only to our physical bodies and our social lives and our mental health, but he has destroyed our spiritual health. And in the end of our lives, it is our spiritual health that we move into the next realm with, that we will end up in heaven or hell. And Satan wants us in hell with him, and we don't want to be there. We want to be in heaven with God. So we need to be able to figure out all of these pieces of forgiveness in our life and trauma, whether we are causing harm to others, whether they are causing harm to us, or whether we are holding God responsible for it. We need to be able to sort all of that out so that we have a good relationship with God and we take our spiritual health right into heaven with us.
So what does it look like when Satan uses what you keep as a secret against you?
So it often looks like PTSD, or what young people are now calling a trigger. You've triggered me. You've said something that hurt my feelings because somebody else has said something to hurt my feelings. That is what happens when Satan keeps poking at us, keeps bothering it with us. We may lie down to go to sleep and Satan will come and whisper in our ears the things that have happened in us and we can't sleep, or we have nightmares because of it. All of that is stuff that can be gotten rid of as God seeks for us to offer forgiveness to somebody else, and as we learn to live in peace and harmony with God.
But the example that you used before, where God intended us to be married, and then a couple years later he has a drinking problem. Do I take that to God of what to do with that situation in a marriage where it was like, yes, I know that you told me this at the beginning, but what do I do now?
Absolutely. You take all of your problems to God. That should be our first place to go. God will give you direction and insight in what to do. I had that exact experience. My husband had a mental health breakdown just about the point had been married for 20 years, and God told me to have him leave. But he didn't tell me to get a divorce. You need to listen to God carefully and take the steps God tells you to keep yourself safe, to keep the people around you safe, to move them into a position where God can work on their lives as well. But you need to start with God. Human advice is never good. Human advice is tainted by the experiences of the people around you. If you ask someone who has been married for a long time to an abusive person, she's going to tell you to stay in that abusive marriage. If you are talking to someone who's been divorced twice because of domestic violence, they are going to tell you to run and flee immediately. Neither of those people are speaking out of an understanding of you, your partner, and your situation, and the truth of all of that. Only God can speak from all of that area and give you the steps you need to take. It's very, very important that you take the steps God gives you and not the steps that humans give you. Now, God may tell you to go to a good counselor. He may guide you and direct you to a counselor he wants you to be able to hear from and take advice from. It's not that he doesn't use humans to help us, but he doesn't encourage us to just go randomly talking to everybody and trying to get advice. God does not expect us to post it on Facebook and look for an answer. He expects us to go to him and seek the answer there. So God is really asking us to offer forgiveness to others and to make sure that we are living in forgiveness with him, because he wants us to have peace and safety. From 1 Samuel 12, it says, he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you so that you lived in safety. That's why God wants you to to offer forgiveness and to be able to move away so that you can live in safety. Jeremiah says, surely I will deliver you with a good purpose. He delivers us so we can have a good purpose, so we can have a good life. But he gives us directions in that meantime too. In Luke 6, he says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. This is important, that even though we get out of the situation, that we get away from those who have harmed us, that we offer forgiveness, that we still remember that we need to pray for them, we need to bless them, we need to spiritually offer them the opportunity to have a better life. Why do we have to treat our enemies well? Because Colossians says we were once enemies of God and he has accepted us back. Romans 5:10 says, if we were enemies of God, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son. How much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? God is a God of reconciliation. He sent Jesus to earth to reconcile us, and he wants us to be reconciled and living at peace with the rest of the world. And that means that we need to be able to pray for those who have hurt and harmed us. And I love this particular verse in Colossians. It comes from Colossians 1, verses 9 to 16. And it's a list of things that we can pray for that person who has harmed us in the past and that we want to be able to continue to bless. So I'm going to put the word him in there in the blank space, but you're going to replace it with the name of the person. Please, God, answer these prayers. Fill him with the knowledge of your will. Help him to live a life worthy of the Lord. Assist him to please God in every way. May he bear fruit in every good work. May he grow in the knowledge of God. May he give great endurance and patience. May he be joyfully thankful to the Father. Rescue him from evil. Bring him into your kingdom. Forgive his sins. When we pray that over people who have harmed us, people who have caused us pain, people who have been abusive to us, we give God a chance to work on them. We give God a chance to bless them the way he wants to bless them, to move in their life the way he wants to move in their life. And this is so important that we be able to do this because he tells us we need to pray for our enemies. So even though he doesn't expect us to bring them back in our lives, he expects us to pray for them. He expects us to behave appropriately and like Christians. When we hold on to unforgiveness and bitterness, when we refuse to pray for somebody, we are operating on Satan's terms. We are adding anger and bitterness and hostility and rage into the world, and Satan wins. So go ahead. Ask God to help you with all of those people that have harmed you. Ask God to forgive you for all the ways you have harmed others. Ask God that you want to live in peace, and then pray blessings over the people who have harmed you. Pray blessings over the people, whether you know their name or not. Use that verse in Colossians 1, 9 through 16 to be able to pray for them. You don't have to do it every day. You just have to do it once. God may ask you to do it again if it's a long-term kind of a problem, but just go ahead and try it. See what kind of joy and peace it brings to your heart and your soul. So I'm hoping that this class has really helped you to understand forgiveness better, understand how it impacts all of your health, your spiritual health, your social health, your mental health, and your physical health. If you want to know more or you want to go into it a little bit deeper, I have written a book on it. It's called The Everyday Christian's Guide to Forgiveness, and it does help you not only to understand all of this in much more depth, but at the end of every chapter, it gives you some questions to help you go and dig into your own life and figure out what's there that needs forgiveness and how to move forward with God, as well as a much deeper understanding and the biblical verses that are involved in the issue of forgiveness from God. I also want to encourage you to maybe pick up the book I've written called Forgiveness is an Evangelism Tool if you want to be an evangelist or if you feel a calling to reach out to others. This is not a book about forgiveness on its own. It's actually a book that covers all of the major religions in the world, what they teach on forgiveness, how it compares to Christianity, and it gives you a point to start a conversation with someone who has a faith but is not a Christian on why they still need forgiveness from God the Creator and what Jesus did on the cross. Both of those books are available on Amazon under my name, Karen Lang, and the pictures are up so you can see what they look like. I really hope that this has blessed you, has helped you to live in a lot more peace. I would love feedback. I want to encourage you to email me at appleofhisEyeservices@gmail.com. Find that on Facebook, or use the Kingdom Women Rising page on Facebook that if you've connected in there to be able to reach back out and let me know how this is going. If you feel like you are struggling with unforgiveness or you're struggling with something in life and you just want to talk it out, I am always willing to talk it out. Again, reach out by email or through Facebook, and we will set up a time for you and I to sit and talk. I really enjoy helping people, men and women, to be able to break free of the burden of unforgiveness and be able to live as God wants them to live. Thanks. Have a great day.